This video is a study of the fascinating history of the Lolita recreational area. I am Mike Adams. Lolita is now a beautiful recreational park maintained by the National Forest Service. Located 6 miles south of Marienville, Pennsylvania, it is on the southeast corner of the Allegheny National Forest. It is well supplied with picnic tables, outdoor fireplaces, campgrounds, and hiking trails. A dam on the east branch of Millstone Creek forms a swimming pool. There is nothing visible to remind us that Lolita was once a bustling lumber town. But Lolita was once a roaring lumber camp operating between 1898 and 1913. The Tonesta Valley Railroad built a branch to Lolita in 1898. This branch line is just one example of branches built to connect the Tonesta Valley with any one of a number of profitable logging camps of that time. The Tonesta Valley Railroad was so named because it passed through the valley of Tonesta Creek. It connected Lolita with the lumber mill and Pennsylvania Railroad main line in Sheffield. There were trains that carried finished lumber and trains that hauled logs to be cut. Lolita locomotives and log loaders. Some of the locomotives on the Tonesta Valley Railroad, which ran through Lolita, were conventional steam locomotives using dry rods to propel the wheels. But others used a radical new design that came along as late as the 1880s. These were gear-driven and had a different alignment of the cylinders. Locomotives with the new design were tailor-made to operate on the hastily built, uneven tracks used for logging. There were 3 different designs of gear-driven locomotives used on the Tonesta Valley Railway. One was called the Climax, and the second was called the Heisler. And there was a third kind of gear-driven locomotive called the Shay. These locomotives gave access to the remotest parts of the forest in the Allegheny Plateau. A key piece of equipment for Pennsylvania lumbering was the log loader. These were steam-driven and placed on narrow-gauge trucks to allow moving from place to place. They were used to load logs on railroad cars. The log loaders greatly increased the efficiency of logging operations. The Lolita Lumber Camp was designed and built by the Amsler and Campbell Company and at one point had over 600 inhabitants. Here are the details of its development. Land was cleared in 1898 and a large sawmill was built. A town was laid out and buildings constructed to provide for the needs of a large workforce. The mill was completed in early 1899 and the mill began sawing lumber soon thereafter. A broom handle factory was added. By December the town numbered 29 dwellings, 2 boarding houses, a schoolhouse, livery stable, ice house, a general store, blacksmith shop, and post office. Here is the school in 1907. A dam had been built on the east branch of Millstone Creek to form a large mill pond heated by steam from the mill. The log pond was much bigger than the swimming area that now exists. Amsler and Campbell purchased a Shay locomotive to handle the switching duties at Lolita. In May 1903, Lolita was bought by the Central Pennsylvania Lumber Company, who bought the mill, timberland, logging railroads, and locomotives. After this time, more of the logs were shipped over the Tonesta Valley Railway to the large mill in Sheffield. Here, they could be cut into lumber more efficiently. In 1913, the lumber ran out and the Lolita logging camp was abandoned. The tragic result of the logging practices of the day was the devastating impact on the ecology of the forests. The land was stripped bare, totally ravaged. The loggers left an ugly, barren landscape devoid of trees. Most loggers implemented a cut-out and get-out philosophy. You can see that was true of the hillsides around Lolita. and it was true for nearly all of the deforested areas in the region. The logging industry leaders were capitalists with no restrictions. There were no regulations or enforcing agencies to prevent these practices. The mass deforestation caused uncontrolled wildfires, flooding, and erosion, all of which clogged the waterways with sediment and ash, severely limiting the forest's ability to regenerate itself. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, it became evident to the public that the forests were suffering from the destructive impact of widespread forest stripping, logging, and its effects. The reaction was an urgent realization that the forest and watersheds needed to be protected and managed. Something had to change, and it did. As a result of pivotal legislation and the efforts of key individuals, a miraculous recovery of our forests occurred. Dr. Joseph Rothrock was one of those key individuals. He was Pennsylvania's first forestry commissioner. Two of Rothrock's major accomplishments during his tenure as commissioner were his land acquisition program and the creation of a forest academy to train foresters for state service. Foresters were taught the principles of sustainable forestry. Another key individual was Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot became the first chief of the National Forest Service and later became the governor of Pennsylvania. Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington was named in his honor. A pivotal act of the federal government was the Weeks Act, signed into law by President William Howard Taft in 1911. The act was named for the congressman from Massachusetts, John Weeks, who initiated it. The Weeks Act was an interpretation of the U.S. Constitution which permitted the federal government to purchase private land in order to protect the headwaters of rivers and watersheds in the eastern United States. The bill called for fire protection efforts through federal, state, and private cooperation. An important provision of the Weeks Act was $9 million in funding to purchase private lands in the east to create our national forest. Some of the money was used to purchase land that would become the Allegheny National Forest. The Allegheny National Forest now covers more than 500,000 acres of land. The Allegheny National Forest was established in 1923. John Weeks went on to be a U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. Great Depression and the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC program, was created because so many young men were out of work during the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world, lasting from 1929 till 1939. It began after the stock market crash of October 1929, which sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors. A third of all banks failed. Unemployment rose to 25%, and homelessness increased. Hundreds of thousands of young men were out of work. The Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC program, was a work relief program that gave hundreds of thousands of young men employment on environmental projects. These men were of 18 to 28 years of age, unemployed, and not married. Nationwide, the CCC planted more than 3 billion trees and constructed trails, bridges, campground facilities, and shelters in more than 800 parks. The CCC also built wildlife refuges, fish rearing facilities, water storage basins, and animal shelters. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, created the Civilian Conservation Corps with an executive order on April 5, 1933. The CCC was part of his New Deal legislation. 3 CCC camps near Marienville provided over 100 workers for the construction of Lolita. They are annotated on the map. They are Camp 1 at During, Camp 6 at Beaver Meadows, and Camp 9 at Salmon Creek. My father was at Camp 9. The Army had a great influence on the CCC camps. You could see it in the barracks made to house the men and the uniforms they wore. My father learned how to cook at the CCC Camp 9, a passion he carried into the Navy during World War II and on to running a successful restaurant, Jerry's Diner, in Marienville. The young men of the Civilian Conservation Corps worked real hard to build the Lolita recreation area. Here we see the early stages of construction. In this picture, the dam is being built. Notice a ditch has been dug to divert the waters of Millstone Creek. By now the lower dam is finished. There is high water evident here. Notice the tent used to feed the workers or act as the office for the director. In this one, the crew is cutting rock for the dam. Here's how the swimming area looks now. The CCC also built this rustic log bathhouse that people used to change their swimsuits. The efforts of the CCC at Lolita were honored in this sign. It reads, "This monument is dedicated to the Civilian Conservation Corps, 1933 to 1942, who provided forest fire protection, planted billions of trees, and built hundreds of recreation sites across the United States. Between 1933 and 1937, the CCC in the Allegheny National Forest constructed the bathhouse, dam, and picnic pavilions seen here at the Lolita Recreation Area. The campgrounds were added later." The history of Lolita is of personal interest to me. I grew up in Marienville in the 60s. I participated in a special summer program in which we rode a school bus to Lolita every afternoon to swim. I had no idea that Lolita was once a prosperous lumber town. There was no visible evidence to that effect. But I've since learned that Lolita went from being a thriving lumber town to a ghost town in less than 15 years. With the help of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the National Forest Service made Lolita into a wonderful recreation park. They built the swimming area that now remains. The swimming area has recently been reopened after a cleanup of accumulated sediment, wooden material, and organic material. Lolita has become accepted into the National Registry of Historic Places. With the continued excellent caretaking by the National Forest Service, it will continue to be an asset to the region for years to come. Here are the references used in this study. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.